Hey, Retcon Raider here, and welcome to the perpetually delayed August-September Retro. Now, obviously we're running a bit late, given that we're already in the latter half of October, but you know what? That's just becoming the trend these days. Honestly, it's not that I don't enjoy making these retrospectives, though I could certainly understand why someone might think that, given how often they end up getting delayed. Rather, it's more that it's becoming increasingly difficult to justify the amount of time that it takes to make them. I think I've mentioned it before, but I try to weight all of the projects in my queue by perceived demand, and at the end of the day, I have to acknowledge that these retrospectives, while they do serve a valuable purpose, are also simultaneously my single worst performing series. That makes it really hard to justify the time it takes to write, edit, and assemble a retrospective when I've got higher priority projects in my queue. Stuff like Baldur's Gate 3 or Wasteland 3, which are pretty much guaranteed to pull anywhere from 3 to 5 times the overall engagement. That said, I am not planning on actually canceling the retrospective series. Like I said, I do think that the retrospectives serve a very valuable purpose. What I do need to do, though, is to find a faster and more casual way to approach them. This month, I figured I would try a semi-scripted approach. One of the things I've definitely needed to get more practice with is learning to speak more casually when I'm recording. So this might essentially help me kill 2 birds with 1 stone. If I can actually practice speaking more casually while also expediting the production of these new retrospectives, then that's pretty much a win-win. So, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's jump into the numbers here. We've actually got 2 months worth of numbers to look at, but there's honestly not a whole lot to say this time around. The trending is pretty obvious. We saw a large spike in the weeks leading up to the launch for Wasteland 3, and then a slow but steady drop-off in the subsequent weeks, with a slight resurgence as we got towards the early access launch for Baldur's Gate 3. One thing I will say here is that, while these numbers certainly aren't bad, they're also not nearly as spectacular as I had kind of hoped they would end up being. I mean, I suppose ultimately that is easy enough to explain, though. With the alpha and the beta, I basically had semi-exclusive access. So, while I definitely wasn't the only creator who was making videos about those early versions of the game, I was one of just a handful. Once the game actually hit full release, though, I was suddenly in direct competition with dozens, if not hundreds, of other content creators. And let's be honest, I like to take my time with making these videos, so most of the more prolific content creators had already burned through the entire game by the time I was just hitting, episode 10? I actually think some folks had already posted full walkthroughs for the game before it had even officially released. Anyway, the numbers are fine. They're not as great as I would have liked, but they are fine. More importantly, it also gave me a new game to play, and it has actually brought in a fair number of new viewers. I'll also say that, in playing the game, I do think it was worth the wait. But I guess I'd also have to say that I'd be lying if I didn't say I was a little shocked to see just how much content didn't end up making it into the actual launch. That's basically why I ended up throwing together that quick little video about the cut locations. It's funny because the video I actually ended up releasing is only about 1/3 of the cut content I originally planned to talk about. It's just that in writing the outline for the script, I ended up realizing that talking about everything, the characters, the creatures, the more granular game mechanics that didn't make it into the game, if I talked about all of that stuff, I was going to end up with a final video that was like 90 minutes long, There was a lot of stuff to talk about, and that's just the stuff that we actually already know about from pre-release interviews and early teaser material and trailers and actual public statements from the developers, as well as some leaked files from data mining, though I try not to rely on that stuff too heavily. I will say that not all of the cut content was created equally. I mean, there's definitely some stuff in there that is a lot more compelling and interesting than other stuff. For example, they dropped the safecracker mechanic between the alpha and the launch build, and honestly, that's the sort of change that I feel was made for the better. Just to clarify, the safecrackers were originally intended to basically be an artificial limitation in the form of a resource the player would require to actually crack a safe, in addition to the also associated lockpicking requirement. On a similar note, they also got rid of the rogue chance for companions. That was actually present in the beta, which was just a few months before the game actually launched, so they pulled that out at the last minute. And again, I think that's a change that was made for the better. They removed the randomized chance that recruitable companions would act against the player's wishes and just run off and get themselves killed or shoot something that would cause collateral damage or whatever. And while that was more realistic, it didn't make the game more fun, and it represents a change that, although it is technically cut content, it was made for the better to make the game more enjoyable, and I have no problem with that. But given that I was also trying to keep the main Wasteland 3 series moving, I just couldn't afford the kind of time sink that talking about everything would require. So in the end, I narrowed it down to just the cut content that I found the most fascinating. In this case, the locations that they had clearly cut out at some point very late in development, because there were still obvious references and placeholders in the launch version of the game. Regardless, I do still think that Wasteland 3 is great. I actually think it's the best game that inXile has released to date. At the same time, though, I do also feel like they ended up making some rather unfortunate sacrifices and compromises to rush it out the starting gate. Honestly, I think that's something that has plagued every single one of their past projects to varying degrees. They always overpromise and end up having to sacrifice something before their game hits launch. But in this case, I do feel like the game still turned out really great. I do think the game would have been better if we had had more things like the granular vehicle system they originally planned, or a more comprehensive faction and reputation system, or more of the cinematic dialogue that they originally had planned, as well as at least some of the locations I talked about in my recent video. But I also still think that the game, in its current iteration, is fine. It's honestly a common lament. You enjoy a game, so of course you want to see more of it. You get a glimpse of content that you didn't get, and of course you're going to idealize it, or at least want to find out more about it. That is, of course, what drove me to talk about games like Van Buren. I loved the original Fallout games. I wanted to see more, especially after I was less than impressed with some of the later games we did get. In the case of Wasteland 3, we got glimpses of all this fascinating content that for whatever reason didn't make it into the final game, and honestly that's something that happened with Wasteland 2 as well. Not just with the Gippers, but with a variety of other content, including intriguing enemies and art and all sorts of things that they clearly considered at one point, but ultimately discarded before the game actually hit release. I want to find out more about all those things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would have been good if they had been included. Who knows? Maybe the reason they cut out locations like the Everest, the Suicide Forest, is because they weren't fun, or they couldn't get them just right. Maybe they were worried that it didn't live up to the standards set by the rest of the game. You know, maybe if they had included it, people would have played the game and been like, oh wow, Wasteland 3 is a great game, except for that one part. What happened there? That is obviously something we can't know, at least not under the current circumstances. We can only speculate. That said, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't looking forward to the inevitable director's cut version that I think we all know is coming. There's also been some hints at DLC, but I don't know. I guess we'll see where they go with that. Anyway, went off on a bit of a tangent there, but that is definitely one of the risks when it comes to trying to do this sort of semi-scripted approach. Although it may not come across because of how carefully I tend to control what I say and how I say it, which is honestly a holdover from the years and years I spent in customer service, I'm actually pretty prone to rambling and wandering off on increasingly esoteric tangents once I really get going. So in an effort to get us back on topic, the next bullet point on my list is... right. The results of the viewer interest polls over the past few months. First, surprising absolutely no one, Wasteland 3 has basically held a lock on first place for the past 3 months. I will say that is somewhat unusual, because I did anticipate it starting to dip a little as we got into October. Baldur's Gate 3 is another very highly anticipated CRPG release, so I honestly figured that it would end up displacing it once the initial hype surrounding Wasteland 3 started to ebb a little. Obviously, it did not actually end up working out that way, and that's actually why we will be resuming the Wasteland 3 series a little earlier than I originally intended. Now, in regards to Baldur's Gate 3, I think that might actually be because, while Wasteland 3 is a full launch, Baldur's Gate is just an early access launch. While I personally love diving into prototype builds and alphas and betas, I do think that there's a growing number of folks who are just starting to get a little burned out on all these early access release titles. I think we're going to see a much stronger interest in Baldur's Gate 3 as we get closer to the actual full launch, and they start adding in more and more content and later acts. That's when I think the average player will actually sit up and start taking notice. That said, I do also think that the slightly lackluster hype surrounding Baldur's Gate 3 is also because of the somewhat controversial nature of the game itself. It's always rough when you get a new studio handling a sequel for an already established franchise, and in this case, Larian obviously has a really tough road ahead of them. They're not just stuck trying to build a new entry into an already established, beloved franchise, but they're also stuck trying to work with a completely new edition of D&D and a heavily retconned version of Faerun. It's very similar to the same problem that Beamdog faced back when they were trying to make, Siege on Dragonspear? And that, from what I understand, I never played it, was still using the original AD&D rule set. For what it's worth, I will say that I was actually really leery of Baldur's Gate 3. I didn't want to just come out and say it, but based on the early teasers, I didn't think I was going to end up liking the game. The story looked gross, the presentation looked weird, the companions just seemed unlikable. I actually hated the earlier teasers that showcased Asterion. Still, now that I have actually played it, I have to say, I really feel like I underestimated the devs over at Larian, because I am really into it. The game's definitely not perfect. There's a lot of content that still needs to be filled out. There's a whole lot of rough edges that still need smoothing. But I'm really impressed with the writing and the overall framework. This has the makings of an incredibly granular, reactive RPG experience. I'm actually hard-pressed to think of any other CRPG I've played recently that comes even close. At least, recent CRPGs. I will add that caveat. Suffice to say, I am enjoying it. I am very pleasantly surprised. And while the game obviously needs a lot of work, I am very much looking forward to the finished product. Now, cruising on down our list, and I realize I did get a little carried away there, let's go ahead and touch on some of the other highlights real quick. It's worth noting that both Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous have doggedly clung to the 3rd and 4th place slots on the list for 3 months in a row now. It's actually pretty rare for me to see that sort of consistency in these polls. and it pretty much guarantees that we are going to be returning to Kingmaker once we've got an opening in my current production schedule. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but based on current estimates, I think that's going to be towards the end of November, maybe early December. It's really going to depend on exactly how much content we can milk out of the current build for Baldur's Gate 3. The numbers are holding pretty steady so far, and like I said, I am enjoying the heck out of it. But I will take another look at the numbers once we get out towards mid-November. It's also worth keeping in mind that we've also got a few other really interesting games that are hitting some sort of launch over the next couple of months. I actually just finished installing the early access build for Solasta, and I'm going to be trying that out right after I finish making this video. So it's really going to be tough deciding if we're going to jump right back into Kingmaker, or at least touch on one of these other games first. Especially since we've got games like Wrath of the Righteous, Cyberknight's Flashpoint, Realms Beyond, maybe even Xenonauts 2, all hitting some sort of early launch before the end of the year. And that's not even getting into games like Atom RPG 2, Black Geyser, Encased, all of which are already in early access. I just haven't had time to do anything with them. One thing I will say though is that we will probably be skipping Necromunda. I sank about 20 hours into it right after launch, and I've gotta say, it just really didn't impress me. Visually, I do think it looks great. They nailed the feel for the setting, but the actual gameplay and execution, oh man, it's... and I hate being negative, but it's pretty rough. Maybe it'll get better, I will keep monitoring it, but I really feel like they dropped the ball there. Even if the game gets a lot better in the next year or two, it's going to take a lot of work to make people forget how rough this launch was. And look, I hate saying that. I don't like being negative in general, and I actually love Necromunda, the actual tabletop version that this game is based on. I was really looking forward to jumping into what I hoped would be an at least remotely accurate adaptation of a game that I'd spent years playing during my high school and college days. But it really feels like the developers just sort of went off and were intent on making their own game, and then slapped a Necromunda skin on top of it. Getting us back on topic, judging from how sharply viewer interest dropped from September to October, I think it's safe to say that a lot of you guys agree with me on the whole Necromunda thing. But, on a slightly more optimistic note, I will also highlight the fact that while interest in Phoenix Point has also seen a pretty significant drop-off, I don't think that one is really all that unexpected, given that we've already wrapped our Season 1, and we've got all sorts of interesting new games to play with at the moment. I do think that interest in Phoenix Point is going to start rekindling as we get towards that Steam launch in December, and especially once we start getting towards that Festering Skies expansion next year. That said, while I would absolutely love to do a Season 2, I will hold off on making any promises for now. We'll take a look at what the demand is once we get a little closer to that expansion. Whew, okay, so we are definitely over time now, and my throat is starting to get a little rough, so I do need to start wrapping this up, but I would like to touch on a couple of other things real quick. First up, as much as I hate to do it, I think we're going to have to put a pin in the Magister Beta series for now. I really enjoyed playing it, and it got a better response than I thought it would. But I've just been having too many recurring issues with automated copyright claims on those first 3 episodes. It's fine though. I obviously don't take it personally, it was kind of a rushed project, so I didn't do my usual due diligence, or I might have caught that certain songs on the soundtrack are problematic for use in monetized YouTube videos. I actually already went back and scrubbed them from the first 3 episodes that I already uploaded, but it does give me pause in wanting to dedicate hours of recording and production time towards making more episodes. I mean, sure, I could just mute the soundtrack entirely and not have to worry about it, but I feel like that would actually take a lot away from the overall viewing experience. I wish there was a way you could just mute specific songs on the track, so that you could still include music in the videos, just not the music that will be automatically claimed. It's actually somewhat similar to the problems I ran into with Disco Elysium, another game I really wanted to spend more time with. Though, in that case, there were admittedly some other issues that I ended up running into. Kuno. Oh, and one last thing before we start wrapping things up. But yeah, I kind of don't want to go into this, but I did receive a lot of messages over the past couple of months about other people who were basically stealing my content and re-uploading it with their own branding attached. I'm going to go on the record here and say that that's not cool. I don't want to have to start watermarking my videos to discourage that sort of thing, but I will if I absolutely have to. That said, I'm generally pretty casual about letting people reuse portions of my content, as long as they get my permission first, or at least go through the minimal effort of crediting me for it. I've actually given plenty of people permission to use the custom music tracks for my Fallout Van Buren series in their own projects, and I've let a few folks recycle pieces of my gameplay footage for use in their own reviews or analysis videos. Heck, Snapshot Games actually has standing permission from me to use any of my Phoenix Point content on their own channel if they choose to do so. I have no real affiliation with them these days, but they were really cool to me during my first couple of years back when I was just getting started. I am more than happy to give something back to them, even if it is just with my, admittedly out-of-date videos about speculative fiction analysis and older versions of the game. Anyway, I don't like having to come down on anyone. I'm a pretty lenient dude, and I'm usually happy to work something out. But don't just steal my content and then act like you're the victim when I contact you about it. I've got some really angry emails in my inbox, all archived now because the situations have since been resolved, but not always as pleasantly as I would have liked. I just don't want to have to do that sort of thing on a regular basis. If you want to reuse something from one of my videos, just contact me ahead of time and we can talk about it. That's really all I have to say about that. At any rate, with that unpleasantness behind us, let's go ahead and start wrapping things up. As always, I would like to round things out by thanking you, the viewers, the general audience who actually make up all those individual numbers that I have collected and analyzed from one month to the next. It's always important to me to express how grateful I am for your ongoing support, whether it's just by watching or liking one of my videos, recommending one of my videos to a friend, or even subscribing to the channel. As always, while one month might be better or worse than the next, I am incredibly fortunate that my channel still shows consistent growth from one month to the next. I don't know if we'll ever get to that coveted 100,000 subscriber count, which marks the point where YouTube apparently starts taking a channel seriously, but that's fine. I honestly never even imagined that we'd make it this far, and the simple fact that we have is all thanks to people like you. So, thanks for that. I would, of course, also like to give special thanks to the Raiders, the fine folks who actually help fund the channel, something which is, unfortunately, even more important these days now that this has basically become my full-time job. I mean, don't get me wrong, that's something I've always kind of entertained and hoped might end up happening one day. The channel becoming self-sustainable to the point where it could cover my bills and maybe even give me a little extra to put aside in savings. This just ended up happening a bit earlier and more abruptly than I had originally been hoping for. As always, I really don't want to get into the specifics, but suffice to say, current events. I'm sure you can extrapolate. That said, I will note that the Raiders have actually been really generous. Although the ad rev numbers for Wasteland 2 and Baldur's Gate have been lower than I would like, the Raiders have actually really helped with that. The money they donate goes towards covering all sorts of expenses, including the software and equipment I use to make these videos, the caffeine I use to never sleep, the food I use to feed my cats and occasionally myself, and, while it isn't quite enough to cover major expenses like rent or insurance, it does help cover at least some of those costs. Under the circumstances, I really can't complain, but I certainly can be grateful. And I am. So, with that in mind, I would like to give special thanks to the honorary raiders from August and September. A Normal Joe, a Dragon 707, Austin Fagan, Benjamin Gray, Brad Quinn, Cecil Kane, CRXCRVS, Ethan Vonderweed, Flamebeard, ICU Uwu, Kim S. Jensen, Mark Giemza, Mark Richards, Matt Lietzen, Maximilian Monk, Mozzie Melton, Misha, Nerd Prof, Optimal 2, Rob H, Scott Brown, Tom Edward Idland, and Victoria Babenko. Apologies to anyone whose name I mispronounced. Feel free to send me corrections as needed. And extra special thanks to the veteran raiders from August and September. AdriRaven, Alois, Ash, Ben Hollingshead, Drakiith, Eric Teichmiller, Exsellsior, James Trimmier, Jace Orcblood, Lady Shayna, Laura and Mike, Leroynukenson, Loki K, Loolaloo, Nod Goblin Nico, Sir Skelebit, Terry Williams, TheBookThief, The Link King, TK16151, Thomas Pietkowski, Vertigo 322, and Woe77. Aside from that, we've also got the usual special mention for folks like Revenant, my lone raider lord, as well as the small but steadily growing number of raider captains, including Anerdinwarpaint, Matthew Holmquist, Nathan Welch Jr., and Valinrook. Plus, I believe I just picked up a new one. Let me see here. Ah, yes, Antonio Hernandez. So I might as well tag him on here too. Now, just to clarify, the Raider Captains, I previously referred to them as sponsors. It's a bit of a misnomer. I have had some people tell me that it makes them assume I'm doing corporate sponsored material, like a paid advert, and that is not the case. I think I've done that once or twice in the past, but I've always clearly earmarked it. In this particular case, the Raider Captains are simply passionate patrons who have taken a liking to one or more of these series that I'm currently running, or that I might run in the future, and are directly funding my work on that series. And while that might sound a bit weird, it does give me a lot more leeway when it comes to continuing a series even if the numbers start to dip below a certain threshold. Under most normal circumstances, if a series performance drops below a certain amount, I have to start giving more and more serious consideration to moving on to something else that might be more successful. In this particular case, I'm a lot more secure in working on games like Baldur's Gate or Wasteland 3, because I have people who are, I guess, directly funding me working on those. I don't want to say they're paying me to do it, because that makes it sound weird, but I guess that is technically what it essentially comes down to. They are paying me to continue doing what I would like to do, and I really appreciate that. Oh, that was awkward. Anyway, let's go ahead and finish this up. Normally, this is where I'd insert my obligatory Patreon plug, but I feel like I've already mentioned it enough, and we are coming up on the half-hour mark here. In fact, we may have just passed it. So we will make this quick. If you like my content and you would like to help fund the channel, feel free to check out the links to the PayPal or Patreon accounts below. While I am a small channel and I can't really afford much in the way of rewards, depending on tier, patronage will net you an assortment of shoutouts, access to my semi-frequent blogs, access to polls so you can influence future content, preferential placement on waiting lists for games like Phoenix Point, Battle Brothers, Battletech, you know, the squad level stuff where I can actually customize my soldiers. And even, for the veteran raiders and above, early access to the occasional video. Just in case you're wondering how that one guy occasionally gets first comment 12 hours before a video actually goes live. Thanks, Gunslinger. At any rate, that is way more yammering than I intended to do, such as the risk, I suppose, of going in with nothing but a list of bullet points and instructions to myself to wing it. Regardless, if you made it this far, more power to you. If you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments below. If you didn't, I guess you can let me know that too. You know, that's cool. I won't feel bad. But regardless, this is Retcon Raider, signing off. Thanks for listening.